Thank you for joining me on the Bold Lines podcast. Today, we are going to go through a follow-up of last week's episode. We are going to continue talking about observing ego. I'm going to give a brief overview of last week's content, and then we're going to get into how we can expand it. Last week, we went over what observing ego is and how it functions. Observing ego is this floating eye above us. It gives us information and helps us see outside of ourselves. We talked about this idea called egocentrism, this inability to see outside of self. There are specific diagnoses that can either inhibit or turn off this floating eye. And for many people, growing up and becoming more healthy is opening that eye more and more. As this floating eye gives us information, it can feed us new ideas or embrace complexity for those who have differing viewpoints or need different things. Observing ego is the foundation for empathy and effective communication. This floating eye tells us what we might need to know and what information can be useful. Observing ego can be more or less present depending on our situation and mental health. So that was last week's episode. Today, we're moving into the practical application. What does it look like to engage in observing ego? What is it that I teach my clients to help them understand their point of view and the point of view of others? There are 7 different positions of observing ego. There are 7 different points of view. We're going to go over all of them, and I'm going to give some review at the end. I will preface, there is a lot of information in this topic. If you are unsure about what something meant or how to apply it, go back and listen again. The hope from this episode is that you can take information that is immediately useful to you, and you can gain some insight on what effective therapy can do for you. So these 7 positions. It's important to know there's a difference between not understanding one of these positions and choosing not to prioritize them. There's this saying that tells me a lot about someone's observing ego. And that is, I don't care what people think. Well, honestly, you should. It's how you're able to interact with other people. It's how you're able to connect and make lasting relationships. But that comment, I don't care what people think, it gives some insight into what people prioritize. When somebody says, I don't care what people think, it could be that they've considered what others think and believe and do not value it. They could be denying that it affects them, or they might not have any concept of it at all. This is where observing ego becomes useful. When we're looking at what people say, when we're paying attention to how they're saying it, it gives us information on how observable the world appears to someone. Do they know that they don't know things, or do they believe that whatever's in front of them is the truth? I will say in all 7 of these positions, most people have strengths and weaknesses. It would be very rare, I haven't ever found anyone, that can do all 7 of these really well. Some people are better at them than others. I characterize strengths by accurate views that balance reality and emotional experiences. Categorize weaknesses as either misunderstanding reality or not being aware of the existence of it. There can be a little argument in this, but I think it's important to come back into reality. Sure, some of it is arguable, but there's no such thing as relative morality and truth. We're going to talk about that interesting belief system of my truth here soon, because I think it sheds some deeper light onto observing ego and maturity. It's incredibly difficult to utilize multiple points of view at once. It should make your head hurt if you really try to do it, especially at the beginning. Every client that I explain this to, and they attempt to do it in session, everybody gets a little weary. And that's normal. It's a lot of work to consider a whole bunch of different things at the same time. So let's start with the very first position of observing ego, and that is looking in yourself. This position looks at how your own functioning affects you at the time. I work on this position of observing ego with all of my clients through the repeated simple question, what is going on in your mind, your body, and your emotions? Those that are really good at seeing inside of themselves can evaluate all three of those on a somewhat objective level. What is it that they're thinking? What is happening for them physically? And what emotions are they experiencing? Someone who handles this position well can take all of that information and decide what to do with it. Being proficient at looking inside of yourself is truly perceiving what is happening and evaluating the cause. Let me give some examples for the mind. Are you thinking about something to avoid something else, to process something important to you, or are you trying to change your perspective? To the physical part, are you having a stomach ache because of anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, or bad tacos? For the emotions, are you anxious because of a trauma response, too much caffeine, or you're overvaluing something that shouldn't have as much pull in your life? This is what I mean by what's happening in your mind, your body, and your emotions, and what it looks like to examine what is happening inside of yourself. This point of view can cause a great deal of argument. If someone makes an assertion on what we're thinking, feeling, or what is happening in our body and we disagree with it, it can feel like overreach, as if someone were gaslighting. My goodness, I hate that term. Or they were to try to confuse you with what's actually happening. This is where the idea of my truth comes from. My truth, or relative truth, or relative morality, is just a form of egocentrism, like we talked about in the last episode. What is happening inside of me must be true of everyone else. There are some people that are very good at seeing inside of themselves, but have weaknesses in other areas. They might be able to truly view what's going on, but misapply it. The second position we're going to be talking about observing ego is viewing another person from inside of you. This viewing another is what we see in body language, temperament, and speech. This isn't the same thing as what someone is feeling or thinking. This viewing another can be related to everything from attraction to threat assessment. We view other people on many important factors. We look at someone's sex, their age, maybe some of the influences, or the level of presence that they carry in a room. You can think of this in some ways like the little snapshot we take when we first look at someone. What is it that we assume about their social hierarchy? Maybe about who they are or what influences them. We can get an idea of their affiliation by the way that they dress, the way that they position themselves amongst others. I will say there is some evidence of behavioral trends connected to the way that people look. In some of the most obvious circumstances, if someone appears to be dangerous because of the way that they're dressing, outside of strict prejudice, that can give us good information. This is the threat assessment. If someone is looking at you menacingly, not breaking eye contact and walking toward you, we can consider that a threat. That is a good view of another person from observing ego. I will say, in connection to prejudice, it can actually be a good thing around safety and assessment of character. We all have to be prejudiced. We all have to make quick decisions on people's identity and character. Otherwise, we're going to spend an entire day looking at every point of view of a single person and get nothing done. A great way to tell the difference between what someone might be internally experiencing and what we see in them is the RBF, the resting you know what face. How someone presents may not truly express what they are feeling internally. It might just be that's how they're situated. The fact that we can tell that those are two different things is evidence that our observing ego can differentiate between how someone is presenting and what they might be internally experiencing. Interestingly enough, we can get confused or uneasy if the presentation doesn't match personality. Those that are really good at this kind of assessment either tend to be in some sort of evaluation occupation where they view and check people Or they're the ones that have a great influence on others. We'll talk about why that happens here in just a minute. The third position of observing ego is inside another person. This is that empathy piece that we've talked about a few times in the past couple episodes. This is what's happening in the mind, the body, and the emotions of someone else. This isn't necessarily evaluating what is right or wrong. It's just a way to be aware of it. If we want to be proficient in understanding what's happening in someone else's mind, body, and emotions, we have to remember that what's going on internally is likely not the exact same thing we experience. Again, not necessarily better or worse, but it is fundamentally different. True empathy isn't just acknowledging that other people can think differently. It's giving a baseline sense of value to the differences. There are things that I can be empathetic about and also blame people for. That's not mutually exclusive. I can engage and connect with the harsh things that people experience while also recognizing that it is almost entirely their fault. A great example of this, if someone is in a car accident because, let's say, they were drinking, I can have empathy that they might be in pain or that they're experiencing regret. I can also blame them for drinking and driving. Without this sense of empathy, we can come off as cold, callous, or uncaring. Therapists should be good at looking inside another person, but many are not. If a therapist cannot make accurate assumptions of your internal experience, they will likely give advice or insight that is divorced from what you actually need. Good therapists are effective at true empathy, engaging with what someone might feel. Seeing that internal experience, having that sense of empathy should influence you, but it doesn't necessarily have to change your course. I'm going to give an example of where this struggle to see what's going on inside of other people plays out in more popular or wide culture. And that is in discussions of international politics or intervention. I saw this picture on Twitter, and I think it very much plays out a sense of egocentrism and a lack of effective observing ego. This picture said, "You have more in common with a middle-class worker in Lebanon than you do with an American billionaire." As an American, no, you don't. The only reason someone would feel like they have that sense of connection is if they misunderstand that other people think and experience things differently, particularly around culture. The culture of the US and Lebanon are very different. Just by that factor, we don't have a whole lot in common. We might share humanity, but our point of views are likely very different. One interesting byproduct of this rampant failure is that those who seem to hold a sense of high social hierarchy can assume that others are as capable or competent as they are. What they see as empathy might be assuming something that other people or other cultures just simply aren't aware of. It's kind of where this whole savior complex thing comes into play, where you can have all of these people who misassign empathy and then get really confused when they're not given the same support. Those that struggle seeing internal experiences are very easily personified in something I saw on Twitter not too long ago. A failure at accurate empathy came out in this picture that said, "You have more in common with a middle-class worker in Lebanon than you do with an American billionaire." That is absolutely not true. To assume so, to assume that both cultures, both points of views, both assumptions of right and wrong and expectations for life in the world are aligned is not correct. It's incredibly childish and egocentric. Cultures are very, very different. It's okay to say so, that people on a different side of the globe could think and see and experience the world completely different than you. To assign a sense of camaraderie between the two is shallow. It's just connecting middle class because you want to make a point. If you assume that everyone is as capable or competent or smart or knows as much as you do, you will make false assumptions like this, making these grand statements about how people are connected when in reality, there isn't a lot that actually connects them other than a shared humanity. The last point of view of observing ego is looking out from others into how they view you. This floating eye giving information on what others might see in you and about you. This fourth position, seeing how others view you, your external signals, is similar to how we view other people. However, this does include what their assumptions and expectations of us are. What is it that they believe about us or they assume about us, just looking at the way that we walk, talk, interact with other people? In order to do this well, though, you have to understand context in the person's past history. Now, you cannot do this for everyone. I mentioned Twitter just a minute ago. If I were to try to assume the deepest parts of everyone's view of me and what they're internally experiencing, I would never leave a single like. I would be stuck there. But there are people that are very, very good at seeing what other people view in them, and there are people that are really, really bad at it. Let's go to the phrase that I brought up at the beginning of this episode. I don't care what other people think of me. Yes, you do. Almost every single person does. It's why we wear clothing. It's why we interact. It's why we want friendship. It's why we want conflict. We do care what other people think. The only living people that don't care what other people think are either asleep or in a coma. I said just a second ago, the way we dress, the way we speak, the way we act, all signals social influence and aligns us with a certain group of people. And that way, we absolutely care what people think. We are inherently social creatures. We cannot escape the fact that we do care what people think. How we let it influence us is different. I will say that many people, including a lot of clients, may not be aware of how they present. Their internal experience is something they might be aware of. They might even be able to be empathetic, but they might struggle with understanding how other people view them. An easy example of this is when someone assumes that people don't like them, when in reality, they might just appear intimidating or difficult to approach. It's misunderstanding what other people read in you. This can cause confusion why someone isn't able to access certain spaces or conversations. They might discount their ability to connect or write themselves out of relationships because they misunderstand how other people view them. An easy way to see a failure in this is when someone says they did the right thing, but socially it didn't work out. There's a good chance someone just misunderstood how other people view them. Understanding this is essential to social influence of any capacity. Salesmen of all kinds are pros at this. Manipulative people are also really good at this. Those two things can be in common. Being what someone else needs you to be is the ultimate example of this. In effective social influence, you align yourself with the person you're speaking to. If you can influence the way that other people see you, if you can train someone's eye to view you a certain way, they will likely give you favorable insight or treatment. If you want to be friends or have a healthy romantic relationship, you absolutely have to be aware of this. I've had many clients or couples over the years that say, well, I didn't say that. I wasn't being mean. But if I were to video the interaction I just saw in front of me, their face and their body language wouldn't show that. So those are the main four. Inside yourself, viewing another, inside another, and how they view you. The last three are more straightforward and will take much less time. These three positions of the floating eye, the observing ego, are the past, the present, and the future. So what is observing ego in the past? It is the beliefs or experiences that are influencing that interaction. What is it that has affected us in the past? That is changing the way we do things now. That can be through trauma, lessons, or training. Some people can feel in danger in the present because of the past. That's an observing ego that can be over-applied. The floating I might be seeing something in the past that isn't actually present. These can be positive or negative influences, but this floating I needs to be able to view how the past affects now. If we were to take the point of view of the observing ego in the present, it would encapsulate current culture. What is happening in the world? What's going on? What are the catchphrases that tend to get people's attention? The little words and phrases that people say and we know mean something bigger. This present observing ego also examines what's happening in the room you are in. What are the expectations or atmosphere? Is something agreeable or seen as beneficial in this moment, but maybe not another? That's an engagement in present observing ego. This present observing ego could also be seen in a local or larger sense, like in family or friendship implications. Are there some friends where it's a good idea to act a certain way? Are there some social situations where it's effective to do something? A way that I do this personally is I pay attention to present atmosphere in therapy in the office. I value it differently at my office than I do at home. Those views are completely different. Does it make me a different person? I'm just in a different place, so I see different pictures. The last part, the future. The future can be a little more difficult to consider. It's something that takes a little bit of time. People tend to understand it through some questions, so I'll pose those to you to see what you can come up with. What is it that your future self would want to see in this moment? What hopes or dreams do you have in mind? If you were to consider legacy, what legacy are you building that you will want to say that you left behind? Some of this can be short-term. Future observing ego can say, I will deal with frustration now so I can have something better later. Easy example, if I discipline my child, go through the hard work now, it'll be easier and more loving later on. So I've given you the 7 active points of observing ego. I would encourage you to go back and listen to them again if need be and see, where is it that you struggle? Where is it that you're successful? What is it that brings you anxiety? Are you over-invested in how people view you and you might just be inaccurate? That could drastically change the way that you address your own anxiety. This is my first 2-part episode. It's about a topic I'm very passionate about. Let me know if you thought this was useful, if you liked having this broken up and explained in depth. Remember that this is a lot to take in. Observing ego for most people is a brand new concept, and to see 7 different positions at once is impossible, even by someone who knows that it's happening. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something useful out of this. If you thought that this could be beneficial to someone else, please share this episode through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also leave a tip to help pay for the production of this podcast. If you have any questions, things that you would want to hear about, post those. I'll put a link in the description. You can ask a question. Thank you so much for listening. Keep walking towards healing and helping those around you.